you don't know me, I'm the potato cropping systems weed scientist. I'm at the Aberdeen Research and Extension Center. And here's kind of the rundown of how we do our Ag Talk Tuesdays. We have announcements and things like that. And then a roundtable discussion. We kick that off with myself, Juliet Marshall, and Kasha Duhlman. Juliet's the cereals pathology, seed and agronomy research scientist, and Kasha's the extension potato seed specialist. Or is it potato extension seed specialist? I'm not, she'll have to tell you. So just a reminder, we have Ag Talk Tuesdays every first and third Tuesday of the month through August. And after we kick off this roundtable by us three, we really liked when you, any of you join in to tell us about issues or have questions or observations on what's happening in your neck of the woods. And then we'll have our featured speakers. We have two excellent speakers today. Linda Schott, our nutrient and waste management specialist. She'll talk about in-season nutrient management. And then Haro Martí, he's the Gooding County Extension educator, and he'll talk about weed and chemical load on compost versus manure. So you, of course, all are signed up, so you can see the schedule online. Please ask others to sign up. We have a flyer now that you can print out and pin up anywhere or email to people. We have an exciting schedule. We've had one and continue to do so. On June 16th, there'll be Juliet Marshall and Joseph Sagers. July 7th will be Shi Liang. On July 21st, we're very excited to have the Dean of College and Ag Life Sciences coming into our meeting, speak with us, Dean Perella. August 4th, we have Ben Eborn, and then August 18th, Jason Thomas. So without further ado, I'll just give my announcements and then I'll turn it over to Juliet and Kasha, and then we can come back to me to talk about weed science problems, issues, exciting things happening in the potato world. My announcements, let's see. I will be having my annual pest management, weed management tour here at the Aberdeen Research and Extension Center. It'll be on June 30th, Tuesday, June 30th. We have registration starting at 8:30, and then the tour goes from 9 to noon. And this year, rather than trying to social distance on our trailers, we'll have each of you jump in your vehicles, your pickups, and follow us around to all the different stops at the Research and Extension Center. That's the way we used to do it before we had tours, so it'll be fun to have like 30 or 40 pickups out there in the field. We usually follow our tour with lunch, but probably won't be able to do that this year because of the COVID-19, but we'll have to see. We usually talk about coarse potato weed science issues. Juliet and Kasha join in with what's going on in their realm of the world, and we have had in the past our potato breeders and other Shi Liang and other research and extensionists from University of Idaho. Other than that, our weed scientists, our new weed scientist over at Kimberly, will be starting July 1st. His name is Albert Adjesiwar. And so we're excited to have him come. He's coming to us from University of Wyoming. So without further ado, let me turn that over to Juliet and Kasha to tell us what's happening.
I want Juliet to go first, so I'm gonna.
Okay, will do. So as long as we're talking about some announcements, if anybody's interested in the Western Wheat Workers meeting, we have that coming up. That will be virtual. In addition, for our extension cereal variety trials, we're going to have a virtual field day for that one as well. And we have invited numerous breeders and companies to present their information via, I guess, video. We will put it online along with maps associated with all the extension variety trials. Still haven't scheduled the final date for that, but it will be not live in person, but it will be available for people to click on our homepage of cereals extension. So other than that, I get to talk a little bit about our crops and the crop growth stages that we're having. It's been pretty quiet overall for our diseases. I have seen a few root rot diseases. We've seen quite a bit of cereal cyst nematode lately, and that's mostly damaging in our spring crop. Cereal cyst nematode is widely distributed, and don't be surprised if you look for it, that you'll find it. We were even surprised to find it on the research station, where we assumed that due to appropriate crop rotation sequences that we would have very little to no problem with cereal cyst nematode. But the levels of cereal cyst nematode in one trial that we hosted was significant enough to actually impact yield and to show that the resistant variety of malt barley that we were aware of that had resistance was yielding more than any of the other varieties, obviously due to, surprise, high enough levels of cereal cyst nematode in the soil to cause yield loss. So there's a saying, look and you shall find it. And yes, we are finding it where we look, even where we make the assumptions that it's not there. I do have a really good extension variety trial screening nursery up in the Hubbard area, west and north, a little bit of Rexburg. We've got very good infection there. So my hope is that we will very quickly be able to report which varieties of wheat and barley, spring wheat and spring barley, are showing the highest degrees of susceptibility and resistance. So in addition to cereal cyst nematode, this morning I was able to get a report from Parma Station that showed there were there's a variety, UI Magic Foundation seed field on Parma Station, and there is stripe rust to be reported in Parma. I have scouts currently out in the Buell area, Kimberly and Rupert, and they're also taking a look for stripe rust, especially in the varieties that we know are susceptible. So I will be putting out an alert pretty quickly today in regards to the stripe rust, where we expect it to move, and where to look for it first. As it moves across the state, which we fully expect it to, I expect it to start popping up in the Kimberly region this week and probably eastern Idaho next week. I'm very concerned about the forecast to be cool and potentially wet next week, increasing the potential for high levels of infection. So that's most of the diseases to talk about in wheat and barley. I haven't seen the stripe rust in barley yet. We do have a wide variety of stages of growth cycles for our winter wheat. We are starting to see heading in the winter variety trials up towards Ryrie. We are finishing the heading notes in the Ryrie, or finishing the heading notes in the Kimberly and Rupert area. And then the spring grain is actually starting to head this week in the Rupert area. So things are moving along quite quickly. I'm looking forward to seeing how the crop turns out. We do have some damage associated with the cold temperatures, and that is everywhere from Soda Springs up to Ashton, lots of cold damage associated with the snow that we had last week. And so don't be surprised to see heads damaged, twisting of the leaves, constricted leaves, and yellowing and burnt leaf tips. So that's what I have to report for small grains. I noticed a couple of other people online that have experience in the small grains. Anybody want to add to what we're talking about with disease or conditions for our small grains? I saw Jen.
Hey, Juliet.
Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, you know, we only have 3 locations in Idaho, but our site in Genesee, I was there yesterday, and it took a little bit of hail damage over the weekend. There is spotty hail damage around northern part of Idaho from the storms over the weekend, but just a little bit here and there, and most of the guys missed it, it looks like.
I did see on Nutrients Agriable Weather site that there was quite a lot of storms all the way, with lots of hail, all the way through Spokane down towards, I guess, the Genesee area where you just reported it from.
Right.
I guess there were some pretty severe storms down here too. There's some, I think 38 power poles were blown down around the Aberdeen area. Wasn't reported very well, but the station was closed until they were able to reconnect power. So must have been some pretty strong storms associated with the destruction on the Aberdeen area. Also, with those strong winds, I fully expect a lot of striped rust spores to be blowing in and have already blown in. And my concern is that the weather conditions are going to be very conducive for additional striped rust to develop and infect. Any other comments associated with small grains? Seeing none, I will pass it back to Kasia.
Hi, everyone. I'm trying to multitask, and I'm not very good at that. I wanted to let you know a couple of things. As I was driving around here in Idaho Falls, west of Idaho Falls, to Blackfoot yesterday, quite a few potato fields were nicely emerging. So we have some good emergence. I also know that some fields are not yet emerged in the area, but it seems like as I'm doing my 80-mile-an-hour investigation, we're getting some nice looking fields out there despite the storms we had the other day. I know that some potatoes did get nipped with frost in the early part of the month, but there really haven't been any issues that I am aware of since then. And let's see, I know that in some of the seed growing areas, there isn't emergence yet. They're a little too cold still. And our trials in Aberdeen, since we planted on May 13th, they haven't emerged yet either. So as far as the regional status of potato, that's the extent of my knowledge. So we'll open it up to others who might have more information. But before we do that, I wanted to let everyone know that our spore traps for the spore trapping network, most of them have been deployed as of Monday. There's one more that I know of that will be deployed tomorrow in the Rexburg area. And we are also setting out our aphid monitoring network, which depends on the yellow buckets, the yellow water buckets, and some select suction traps. And if you're interested in participating in that aphid monitoring network, just pop me an email, kduhlman@uidaho.edu, and we can arrange to get a bucket and a kit for you to use, and we can count the aphids for you and monitor when aphids are in flight in your area. We are not yet skilled at aphid identification. That is a service that will be working towards down the road. We're still, that part of our program is still in progress. But for monitoring numbers when aphids are spiking, that's the kind of information that we can provide you on a weekly basis through the summer. So I'm going to end now because that's all I have to say on potatoes. And I was hoping that there is someone who is participating online with us who can add more information on what's happening with potato acreage and any early season issues. But before I turn that over, one more thing. I did want to mention that as we have cooler temperatures in the forecast and potential rainstorms in the forecast, there's an area in Idaho, in like the Rupert area, where I would say growers should pay attention and think about late blight. And we will have information on early season late blight management in the next newsletter. And that reminded me of one more thing. Dr. Marshall, if you can provide me the snippets on stripe rust, cereal cyst nematode, and your news alert that you were planning on putting out, if you can give that to me as well, I will put that in this week's newsletter for the Ag Talk report.
Sure, I can do that, no problem.
Thank you.
So as Kasha says, does anybody have any information about acres planted, that kind of thing for potatoes at least, and also maybe for small grains?
This is Mike Thornton. I know at the Potato Commission meeting, it's probably been a month or so ago, they were talking, the initial indication was about a 5% decrease in potato acres, but I have not heard an update. Just to follow up on Kasha's comment on late blight, we've got some fields in western Idaho that are potato fields that are close to closing the rows. That's usually a time when you want to consider a fungicide application if you're concerned about late blight, so you can get it down into the canopy. We've got, as Kasha said, some good weather conditions. We've got a ton of volunteer potatoes on this side of the state. We did not find late blight in the field last year, but you can still import it on seed and things like that. So a good time to pay attention to late blight management. And I agree, Kasha.
So Mike, is that down from like about 310,000 acres or what they're close to
Yeah,
that?
I think they were predicting under 300,000 for only the second time in like the last 50 years, close to 290, 295.
Wow, okay.
Mike, as a result of that, I could let you know, and I'm probably sure you already know this, there's been quite a demand for replacement with spring wheat. So our spring wheat seed sources have really dried up because everybody's changing some of their acreage to some of the other crops where they know that they have a market.
Great, I'll go here real quick and then we can open it back up to everybody and anybody that would like to comment or has some questions. As I mentioned, we'll have our weed control tour June 30, and Juliet prompted me because of her announcement that if we can't have the tour because of the virus, we will have a virtual tour. And I'm thinking about having both face-to-face and virtual, if I can work that out, if we can have some people meet and others that won't be able to attend. And again, that's June 30, Tuesday, registration 8:30, and then the tour starts at 9. As far as weeds in potatoes go and weed management, potato crop injury, last year, remember, we had a lot of rain in May, and so we were seeing some issues with some seemingly herbicide damage to potatoes because of some of the herbicides with the rain moved down into the potatoes, germinating, emerging the shoots below the surface. And I didn't think we were going to see any of that this year, but we've had such interesting weather, as has been mentioned, that in fact, I think over in the Treasure Valley area, I think they had like an inch of rainfall, within a few days. Mike can correct me on that. So there are some issues coming in with the soluble herbicides, the most soluble are matrix and metribuzin, and so some of those have moved down below the weed seed germination zone, which is about the top 2 inches. So you might be seeing some breaks in weed control, and the only post-emergence herbicides that you can put on that affect weeds that already have emerged are matrix and metribuzin. So if you have any questions about those, email or text me or call me. That would be great. Since there is upcoming rain and then hot and cold conditions over towards this area, southeastern, eastern area of Idaho, I expect to be getting some calls about injury and then weed breaks as well. Mike mentioned volunteer potato control. I know there is a lot over in southwestern Idaho, and so I'll post here today on the Pacific Northwest Pest Alert the volunteer potato control recommendations that we've had, and we had those out a few years ago, and nothing really has changed about that. So I'll post what we've had in the past. Let's see. Other than that, yeah, Juliet mentioned the crazy weather over here. I know they got the poles back up yesterday, and we did have electricity restored about 6 o'clock, 6:30. That was out in part of the Aberdeen area. So very interesting weather. So any questions about weed management in potatoes? And then if you have thought of something, as far as what Juliet and Kasha have talked about, just jump in. The water's fine. The water's fine. No sharks today. So let us know what's up. And by the way, if you don't want to talk, you can enter it on the chat zone here on this Zoom meeting, and I'll be kind of monitoring that and see if we've got questions and whatnot coming up on the chat.
Pam, just to follow up, yeah, we did have some localized pretty heavy rain. I think in general, we had a lot of southwest Idaho that got up to 2 inches of rain around the 3rd week of May, and in some cases, over an inch in a single storm in fields. So there is some concern about perhaps moving some of the nitrogen that was applied at planting below the root zone. So again, something for people to watch would be the nitrogen status of their crops here early to see if they need to replace some nitrogen that was moved out of the root zone.
Say, Pam, do we,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry, Pam, do we want to invite anyone to speak about other crops besides small grains and potato?
Yes, good point there. Anything else? Quinoa, teff, dried beans, mint, anything. We would love to hear from you.
Well, they're just getting dry beans in the ground here in the Mash Valley area. And corn crop looks good.
What's this, Steve? Speaking of corn crop, I did want to also mention there is some barley yellow dwarf that has been found in the western part of the state. It's obviously kind of late, not necessary to do anything other than to prevent or reduce crop stress. Steve, have you seen any barley yellow dwarf or stripe rust over in that area yet?
You know, I was going somewhere the other day and drove by a wheat field, and it looked like stripe rust, and I had to get somewhere, and I was going to go back and look, and didn't get back over there.
Oh.
Now I can't remember where it was, but it would have been in the wrong area.
Okay, if you can find anything, just let me know.
I will. I'm kind of out and about quite a bit now, so.
Good, thank you.
Juliet, maybe you want to mention the research by Rashed's group about the about the barley yellow dwarf virus that you and I kind of participated in, you know, as far as alternate hosts and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so Arash did mention that there are a substantial number of grassy weeds that will host the virus, that there were a couple of new weed species, and I think, Pam, I can't remember the names of the weeds that were host other than the foxtail barley. What were the other ones?
Right, green foxtail and downy brome, I think was
And
the
so
third one.
The issue is that there's a reservoir of viruses in some of our grassy weeds, which we're not really too surprised about, but that also serve as a wonderful way for overwintering of the virus in some of our perennial weed species. And then it just takes aphids, of course, to transfer those viruses from the weedy grasses into developing crop species.
Right, and there's a paper coming out about that. Overwintering, that can happen on, excuse me, downy brome, which is it can germinate in the fall. And so things can happen, you know, can happen after that's germinated. It can also have some germination in the spring. Green foxtail is a summer annual, so it germinates in the spring, but it can last all season long. So it would provide that source reservoir all the way through, even after spring wheat harvest and you know, into the fall, winter wheat fall planting. And then foxtail barley is a perennial species, so it's around quite a bit, and that would be the other bridge. Very interesting things going on. Anybody else? Like I said, chime in. We'd love to hear from you. And again, if you don't want to talk, you can hit the chat.
Yeah, hi folks. Davey Olsen here with Amalgamated Sugar. I can give a bit of an update about sugar beets, I guess, particularly in the mini cassia area. We have had a bit of a rough start to the season with just under 30,000 acres being replanted, but we're close to fully planted now at about 110,000 acres in mini cassia. The beets are looking good. We're about 2 or 3 weeks away from row closure here. And then in the western areas, Nampa, round through there, they're actually at row closure now. And beets are looking pretty good there too. So growers are just getting their sprays on at the moment. Most growers have put their first glyphosate on, maybe a second, and they're starting to look at pest and disease as well. So yeah, we're kind of up and going with beets for the season and limped through the first part of spring and looking good from now on.
Great, thanks. Just a reminder, a few years back, we did see some glyphosate resistant kochia population over in the Treasure Valley area, and then just on the other side of the border into Oregon. So, you know, keep a lookout on those. You probably remember that beautiful picture of the kochia tumbleweed pattern across the sugar beet field that showed up because glyphosate was the only herbicide used that year. So that's one of the weeds you might want to be on a lookout for your glyphosate applications. Okay, anyone else? And if you think of something later, just jump in between and after our speakers for the day. All right, great. Kasha's going to run the screen controls and whatnot for this. And again, excellent speakers today. I think we start with Linda, and she'll talk about in-season nutrient management, and that'll be followed by Mario, who'll talk about weed and chemical in compost versus manure.
Great. I will share my screen. Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Schott. I am the Nutrient and Waste Management Extension Specialist based in Twin Falls, traditionally the soils position. Although it's a little bit broader than that. I started my position about a year and a half ago and still learning a lot about Idaho cropping, and it's really exciting. I'm in my second season. I feel like I've learned a lot, but learning never ends. So I thought I would talk to you guys today about in-season nutrient management. And I think this is especially timely given all of the rain that we got in the month of May, and really thinking about how that impacts potentially your nutrient management because of leaching. And as I was putting together this presentation, I realized there's so many crops, and obviously Southern Idaho in general from east to west is pretty different. And so I kept it pretty general and really just focused on potatoes, a little bit of sugar beets, but then made some generalizations across all crops. And hopefully you can get something out of this, and you can ask me questions during the presentation afterwards, and also via chat or email. So why care about nutrient management? Appropriate nutrient management is good for the environment, your pocketbook, and soil health. So in terms of the environment, if you apply too much nitrogen to your field or to your lawn or anything like that, it's broader than just agriculture. You can cause nitrate leaching into groundwater due to rain and over irrigation. And that is an issue for drinking water, as a lot of water comes from shallow wells or the aquifer that is very porous and well connected. So this is just a map of Idaho showing areas that have high groundwater nitrates. And something else that I think is really important to talk about is soil health. Everyone is interested in it. A lot of times though, just no-till and cover crops are given a lot of credit and emphasis, but there's a lot of practices that can improve soil health or move you towards healthier soil in general. And one of those is nutrient management. And so if you're doing nutrient management and you are soil sampling and making sure you're being a good steward from that aspect, which obviously has other impacts beyond just the environment, you are on your way to healthier soil. And so it's one way to easily incorporate a soil health management practice into your farming system. So in general, we should follow the 4 R's, use the right source of fertilizer to meet crop needs, the right rate, also making sure we're meeting crop needs and not over fertilizing, the right time, which I'll go into a little bit here in a minute, and then also the right place. So making sure, especially that nutrients stay in your field and not moving off-site, either via overland flow from like phosphorus moves into water bodies or through leaching. So how do you figure out the right rate? Well, first you need to know what crop you're growing, and you need to soil sample. And so there's this really great bulletin from UI that talks about how to soil sample, when to soil sample. In general, it should be done in the spring before planting. You need the right tools. You need to map out your field to figure out, is it uniform? And then submit it to the lab. You'll get back this really great list and some recommendations to figure out what nutrients are in your field. And then you use that to fertilize to prevent over or under fertilization, and both of which can save you money. If you under fertilize throughout the season, then you potentially are knocking your yield. If you over fertilize, well, you've spent too much money on fertilizer. It's not assisting with your yield and is instead fertilizing drinking water. And I obviously didn't go into a lot of detail about that, but there's more information in this extension bulletin, a couple of them through UI. So the other thing, making sure we are fertilizing at the right time when crops need it. So this is just a graph I found, sort of looking at when small grain uses or is uptaking nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur at their different development stages. And as you can see, a lot of it is taken in this middle section, and that's when it needs it the most. What happens if you apply all of your fertilizer in general to any crop early in the season at planting or slightly before planting? Well, that's when you also get all of your rain, or you're trying to fill your profile with irrigation water. So you run the risk of leaching your nitrogen that you just spent time and money on applying and purchasing, and you've lost it, and now your crop can't use it. And granted, you'll never have 100% efficiency on your fertilizer, but we can do a better job if we can split nitrogen. And so this is just showing that every crop is different. Here's the potato growth, that it's slightly different of when they take up NPK and sulfur, and also as the biomass accumulates. So you have to consider when every crop needs their nutrients, and if there's other locations besides pre-plant when you can apply fertilizer. So are you applying fertilizer when your crop needs it? And obviously this goes beyond just when your crop needs it. It's also, can you re-enter your field? You've also got other crops that you're trying to plant at the same time. So it has to be a bigger decision in your management of your entire farm, but it's just something to think about if you're able to do split plant or split fertilization. It may be worth your time and effort to figure that out. So then I just wanted to talk about potatoes a little bit. We're sort of getting, a lot of potatoes have emerged, and potatoes in general tend to have pretty good nutrient management, and I just wanted to go through that a little bit. So some steps is, first you need to set a realistic yield goal, and that's based on your soil type, your previous yields in that field, and the year, your planting date, the variety that you're planting, things like that. And then you need to determine if your field is uniform. So I just sort of made these two images. So if you had a pivot that looked like the one on the left, it might be worthwhile to split it into two sections. So let's say the left section was a sandy loam and the right section was more silty. And granted, that line is not a direct line of a boundary between two different soil types, but it may be worth your time to split that field into two management zones, because they're going to respond differently. They have a different yield potential, potentially. The soil nutrient status is likely different, but it may not be. Whereas on the field on the right, where it's just a small portion of your field, it may not be worth your time to split or effort to do two separate zones, but you want to make sure that your soil samples and subsequent petiole samples are coming from the left side, which is the representative side of that field, so that you're not accidentally pretending that your field is all like the right, fertilizing it as such when it's not appropriate for your whole field. And so you can use previous yield maps to look at this. You can look at soil maps. There's NDVI images that you can get for free offline. There's a lot of different data sets that you can use that are cheap or relatively or free to make those decisions. So then once you figured out if your field is uniform, and maybe it's totally uniform, maybe it's the same soil type and it behaves pretty similarly, you're going to pre-plant soil sample. just to figure out what the nutrient status of your soil is currently. Then you're gonna apply your pre-plant fertilizer or a starter fertilizer with your with it, and then conduct petiole sampling throughout the growing season. And then I'll go into that a little bit in more detail. And then you're gonna harvest and determine yield. And you're gonna figure out, did your yield meet your goal? And if not, why was that? Do you need to reset your yield goal? Or did something else occur in this field that led to a reduction of yield? And then also, it's really important to post-harvest soil sample for a number of reasons. First is, did you use all the nutrients that you applied, or was some of it lost? Did it leach? So you need to take some deeper soil samples to figure out, did you have nitrate leaching throughout the season? That's lost money. Did you use all of your fertilizer uniformly throughout the field? Maybe you have this big area of an underproducing section. Well, that's important to know, because maybe next time you don't fertilize that as much. Maybe you find that this field is worth splitting up into more zones and doing variable rate fertilization to help increase your profitability. And so really, your nutrient management should be incremental. You should aim to improve it every single year, because every single year is different. And to really give thought to, why is it different? What can I do better next year? So for petiole sampling, you want to partition the field in the same way that you did soil sampling if there's these big management changes, these big differences in management zones. So let's say that you split it up into two sections. They're pretty similar soil types, but your yield map from your grain showed that there might be a couple different zones, but your soil sampling came back and said that it was relatively the same. Well, then you may want to do your petiole sampling over the whole field. In another way, maybe it did show that there's these different zones and you should treat them differently. So however you soil sampled, whatever that method was, to continue using those same zones for petiole sampling to make sure that you're getting representative samples. So then you're going to collect 40 to 50 petiole samples per zone or field, depending on how you're managing it, at the same time of day, every single time you take it, every 7 to 10 days, beginning 4 weeks after emergence through 3 weeks before vine kill. And you're going to take the 4th petiole. So I like this image because it shows what that looks like. So you're going to count from the top down. And it's just to be consistent, because all of the different petioles have slightly different nutrient status. And so you need to be able to compare week to week or time period to time period what that trend is. And if you're switching which petioles you're sampling, you're not going to get a consistent trend. And then once you take that petiole, you'll immediately strip off the leaflets and put it in a clean, clearly labeled container so that your labels are consistent as you submit them to the lab. Or maybe your fieldman is doing this for you. And then you'll either store in cool conditions or air dry until submission to the lab, especially if you're delaying submission. And really, you should check with your lab to make sure to see what they suggest. But it's really important to be consistent with your sampling. And that's across all of, in petiole sampling, soil sampling, you have to be consistent, because if you're sampling in the morning on one and the evening in the other, those can be vastly different. If you're switching between fall and spring soil sampling, those are going to be very different. Just to be consistent so that you can compare year to year or sampling period to sampling period as you're going through. And by petiole sampling, you are able to catch, hopefully, you're able to catch any nutrient deficiencies early by looking at the trend, and also adjust your nutrient management accordingly, so that you're not over fertilizing or under fertilizing. Some other considerations is to soil sample in the top 18 inches at the same time as petiole sampling. Maybe not every single time you petiole sample, but every once in a while would be good, especially if you're seeing a decline. So one thing that can happen, especially if there's a lot of fumigation or early in the season, bad weather, there may be enough, let's say, nitrogen in the soil, but it's a crop uptake issue because of biology or something like that. And so it may be that it's not a fertilizer issue, it's an uptake issue. Same thing for phosphorus tends to get tied up. So your soil test will tell you if there's phosphorus available, but it could be that you're missing a micronutrient that is preventing uptake or something for some of these fertility considerations. So it's just something to think about. Also, other things to think about, over irrigation can cause nitrate leaching and a reduction in yields. And with all of the rainfall that we've had this spring, it's the same idea. So be careful with your nutrient management and really pay close attention so that you can address your nutrient management, address crop need before it becomes deficient. And then something I always like to talk about, because soil health is really taking off in Southern Idaho and I mean across the West and the US in general, if you are implementing other soil health management practices in the same field, maybe not in your potato rotation itself, but if you use cover crops, you're trying to reduce your tillage, you've got some previous manure applications, your nitrogen mineralization could change. So your field may behave differently this potato growing season than what it did a few years ago on the same field because of the management practices that you've been doing. And so it may not vary that differently. And it's the same thing, obviously, weather changes also affect nitrogen mineralization year to year. But it's especially important to be careful with your nutrient management if you're implementing other soil health practices. It's once you move one thing and change it, it kind of causes this cascading reaction and a lot of other things change. So just another thing to keep in mind. So then you've done all this sampling and it shows that you're deficient or you need to add more in general. So this is just more in general about nutrient management in potatoes. So nitrogen tends to be and should be spoon-fed throughout the growing season. Potatoes can uptake a lot of nitrogen every day, and it's important to sustain that pool of nitrogen for the potatoes so that you don't lose yield. You can apply fertilizer through the irrigation system depending on how your system's set up. You can broadcast dry product aerially or do a foliar spray. And then for phosphorus, it's best to apply as a pre-plant or starter, but if your phosphorus is tied up because it's calcareous, you have a lot of free lime, you can correct deficiencies with the application through the irrigation system, but you really have to be careful to make sure that you don't get nozzle clogging, that the phosphorus isn't reacting with the calcium in the water. And then for potassium, it's best applied as a pre-plant rather than in the growing season. You can apply it in the growing season, but you have to be careful at the timing of it so you don't harm your potatoes. So then I just wanted to talk really briefly about sugar beets. So in general, nitrogen should be made available to sugar beets by the V4 to 6 stage to prevent beet quality issues associated with high nitrates. In some cases, split applications have been shown to be economically beneficial. So to apply some nitrogen at planting and then the rest of it before the 4 to 6 leaf stage. But it hasn't really been widely looked at, but it is something that is an option, especially thinking about this year where there's a lot of rain, there was a lot of replants, a lot of nitrogen may have been lost in that from first planting to the next planting. And then in general, petiole samples haven't been shown to be good indicators of yield or quality, but they can be really helpful for future nutrient management decisions in further years. So if you monitor your petioles this year in your field, it should help you make nutrient management decisions in the future, is the thought. So then I just had a couple parting thoughts in general about more of a framework of how to think about nutrient management, especially for nitrogen. So for all crops to follow the 4 R's, it seems like there's a lot of split nitrogen. For potatoes, it's spoon-fed, but you can do that same process in other crops. So to make sure that you've got the right source, so that depending on how you're applying it, that it's the right type of fertilizer for your crop needs. And that also includes if you're using manure or compost, to think about, are you over applying fertilizer and potassium, especially the phosphorus, sorry, and you're applying a lot of nitrogen, but are you crediting your previous nitrogen? Are you over applying phosphorus? Making sure that you have the right source for your crop, and then the right rate, which is also this kind of this, not the same concept, but making sure you're not over applying nutrients. And then, but making sure you know what the nutrient needs of your crop are and not over fertilizing. And to know your rate, you have to soil sample. And then the right time. So do you have the ability in your current management practices in your farm in general, do they have the ability to do some split fertilizer applications on some of your crops? And it's just something to give thought to, especially thinking back to those graphs that I showed about when crops need fertilizer. We tend to apply most of it at the beginning of the season, but then in a year like this, you've just watched, you know, your part of your profitability decrease because you have to either apply more fertilizer to account for what was leached, or you over applied, which was just an extra cost, or you now have a yield reduction. So do you have the ability to do split applications? And then the right place. And it's just, with so many crops grown in this valley, think about what kind of root system your crop has. For instance, does your fertilizer need to be banded, or should it be banded? Should it be broadcast and incorporated? Just to give consideration to that, to make sure that we're not applying fertilizer where a crop cannot access it, or will likely not access it and be able to use it during the growing season. And this also is a huge consideration for manure and compost, to make sure that we're not applying near streams or canals, anything that could be a risk to water. So I just wanted to thank you for coming to my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have, or any thoughts, comments.
Excellent, Linda. Anything for Linda right now? I do have a couple questions, but let's open it up. Questions, comments from anybody? So we have a question here. How do you define a healthy soil microbiome?
Yeah, so that's tricky. It's kind of again, I take a more general framework approach that a healthy biome should have bacteria, it should have fungi, you should have a lot of different types of bacteria and fungi, and you should also have, it's not only what is there, but it's what they're doing. And I think in stepping back from just, what you should have exactly, which is, I think, a moving target, and it depends on your crop and the soil and a lot of other things, is that if you're not feeding your biology, you shouldn't expect it to be there. So if you're not feeding it and giving it an opportunity or an environment to thrive, you probably don't have a healthy biome. So if the soil is consistently tilled over and over again, there's not the space to have the biology. You are the same thing if you don't have not like sort of readily available food sources like crop residue. Manure and compost are really great. Those are sustained food sources for biology, so it allows the populations to not only grow but to sustain themselves. Whereas inorganic fertilizer, if you just feed your soil inorganic fertilizer and you're not returning crop residues or adding manure, compost, things like that in overtilling, then it's sort of this short burst. It's like a feast and then starve situation. And so it's just more, do you have the environment where you have the potential to have this great microbiome? I don't know if that answered your question, but in general, it's just tricky to know, complicated, exactly what should be there per se. But you should have a variety of fungi and bacteria, and then also nematodes are not always bad things, especially if they're feeding on bacteria in your soil. Those are a pretty big source of nutrient cycling.
Great. Anyone else before I ask mine? Good. If you think of something, chime in, or we'll give you a chance at after Mario's as well, presentation as well. So, Linda, I have a kind of questioned in two different areas. How do you know the range of depth for the wells that we have, because of our fractured aquifer system? And the reason why I'm wondering about that is water quality. So, have you seen different quality, from deeper or more shallow? I suppose it depends on where you're at. And that would relate to, calcium and things like that, other things happening like tying up your nutrients and whatnot. And I'm interested in it because of, breakdown or tying up herbicides.
Yeah, so I have found that the aquifer here is, I don't know if complicated is the right word, but it's really connected in some areas where there's a lot of water movement and relatively high rates of recharge because it's really connected to the surface, whereas other areas are not as well connected. And it seems that there's these micro aquifer regions where for some reason it's not tightly connected, or it's overly connected. And I know that there's a couple of organizations who've been doing a lot of aquifer testing and tracer studies to figure that out. So I don't really have a great answer to that, other than it's much more, because of the basalt, it's trickier than, let's say, over the Ogallala aquifer that is pretty, relatively the depth across that aquifer, and it is what it is. Here it seems a little bit more complicated.
I agree, complicated. I just like saying that too, Ogallala.
Yeah.
But of course, along the Platte River system all the way through, it's very shallow and very interesting over there. Comments from others about, depth and that kind of thing before I ask my other question? Okay, good. I learned from that, definitely. So my other question, and this, at the end of the season, I know growers, some really bring out their nitrogen all the way out and they have nice green foliage and everything towards the end of the season, but that affects some things that I am interested in such as vine kill. And so what's your recommendation in general, or maybe more specific, about when to stop nitrogen and when to start letting that natural senescence occur rather than carrying it all the way through or too long?
That's a good question. And I think that Mike may have a better answer than this, but I think, and admittedly, I learned a lot just by putting this presentation together, but my understanding was 3 weeks before vine kill, but that could be inaccurate.
Yeah, that's kind of a tough question, Pam, with all the different varieties we have and stuff. I mean, the rule of thumb is that they don't take much nitrogen up for yield purposes after about 70 days after emergence, which for us is usually around the first part of August, end of July. So if you're fertilizing after that, you're probably keeping the plants green and doing some other things, but you're not doing much for your yield. And that's where you can run into complications with maturity and things like that.
Good. Anybody else have anything to add to that or questions about that as far as, towards the end of the season, nitrogen?
Yeah, hi guys. Good job, Linda, first up. Just regarding sugar beets, the kind of rule of thumb, I guess, is to try to run them out of nitrogen about 6 weeks before harvest. So generally, in the growth stage, when you're trying to close canopy, the beets are using kind of 4 to 6 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. But once that canopy closes and the leaf area index approaches around 3, from really canopy closure until harvest, they back right off and start to just use about a pound of nitrogen per acre per day, which generally the soil is supplying anyway through mineralization. So it's actually a good thing to see that crop yellow up 6 weeks before harvest and kind of put its energy towards sugar accumulation.
Great.
Okay, I have a question about sugar beets. Coming from the Midwest, I know we used to sample down to, I think it was 4 feet, just to make sure we knew fertility coming from the year before so that we could figure it out for the current year. What kind of sampling occurs out here for sugar beets? And I had a different question, but now I can't think of it. So anyway, depth and how that works. Oh, and I know the rotation out here anyway is to follow potatoes with sugar beets. And how does that, affect your nitrogen?
Yeah.
So, oh yeah, go ahead, Davey.
Oh, sorry, Linda. Do you want to chime in?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I'll just be quick. So yeah, our standard is to sample to 3 feet. Simply because those beets will get down to that depth. And if you have any nitrates at depth late in the season, that's really a danger period for affecting the quality of the sugar beets. If you've got too much nitrate down low, we know that the beets will get to it. And if they're really uptaking a lot of it late in the season, definitely going to have some sugar quality issues. So yeah, it's important to sample the 3 feet. And the second part of your question regarding following potatoes, yeah, that's a big deal for us because generally there's still a lot of residual nitrogen in those fields. So a lot of guys won't even apply nitrogen after potatoes or even after onions as well. I think onions are another big one. Yeah.
And I would just add that UI's recommendation is also 3 feet or as deep as your soil, because in some locations we know that soil depth is not 3 feet.
Great. Okay, any other questions then or comments before we move on to Mario?
I just had one parting thing. If anyone on here has any suggestions for things that they'd like to hear, I just sort of took a shot in the dark about what I thought would be interesting to talk about. But if there's something else that you all would like to hear, or something you've heard about, even regarding soil health or other crop nutrient management, feel free to drop me a message in the chat box or email Kasha or Juliet, myself, or Pam. Didn't want to forget you, but about those topics. But thank you.
Very good. Applause, applause. Let's see, I think we had another question here. The functions of a healthy soil.
So soil should, I mean, in general, the function of your soil depends on sort of what you're wanting to use it for, which sounds a little convoluted, but it needs to have good structure regardless. It tends to filter water, it needs to hold water, support plant life, support the fauna that lives there. And in general, I like to talk about, for a healthy agricultural soil, it should stay in your field, because if it's not in your field, it's not helpful. So it should not blow or flow. You should be able to cycle nutrients. You should be able to use all the nutrients that you apply. You shouldn't have a lot of residual nutrients left. And it needs to support your crop. So your crop should be healthy. It should be free of disease, which is sort of this pie in the sky look at it. But the idea is, the healthier your soil, the better it will grow your crop for you. And I always also like to talk, if tillage hasn't fixed your problem with infiltration for the past 20 years, it's probably not going to start this year. So there's other tools in the toolbox to try and fix compaction issues or nutrient cycling issues.
Very good. Thank you. Again, applause, applause. And I like that blow or flow or fertilizing your water.
Thanks. Looking forward to hearing from Mario.
So
Yes.
Linda, before we move on to Mario, Linda, just be sure to unshare.
Great. Okay, without further ado, Mario, a Gooding County Extension educator, is going to talk to us today about weed and chemical load on compost versus manure.
There you go. Can you see that, and can you hear me okay?
Yes and yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, well, my name is Mario de Haro. I'm the extension educator in Gooding County, and I work the 6 counties in the Magic Valley with environmental education, basically agricultural environmental management, mostly waste management and nutrient management with livestock producers and crop producers. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the compost versus manure, what happened with weeds and herbicides on them. And the first point I really want to do, and as Linda said, if any of you have any question, please feel free to jump at any time, or we can do the questions at the end. So the first things I want to bring up, because the rest of the presentation works on weeds and herbicides, that there are 2 negative things we don't want on our manure or compost. So the first point I want to do is that both are an excellent source of nutrients. We want to use them. They have some places they have a bad rapport using manure or compost, but on top of the nutrients, they add organic matter that is very needed, especially in Idaho, and an active biological flora and fauna that also is needed. So when we add manures or compost, we are adding much more than just nutrients. Manure has some disadvantages compared to compost, and those are mainly on the way that manure is mostly water, so it has a high content of water compared to compost. So you are transporting a lot of water, so it doesn't get economically viable to transport manure larger distances. That's where compost has huge advantages there. The other one is that compost smooth a lot of things when you compost the manures, and also give you more reliant nutrients in the way that you are mixing everything a little bit more than on manure, when you can have pockets of more or less nutrients. On the other hand, manure is, I would say, one of the cheapest nutrients that you can apply. And on both cases, you're gonna need to supplement, in most cases, nitrogen, because it's the nutrient that is escaping the system when you do use manure and compost. So both of them need to be sampled representatively. That's one of the bad reports that people have against both manure and compost. Say, well, it's not, we cannot have a reliable account of the nutrients, but sometimes it's more related to the lack of sampling or sampling not done properly than that variability. We know that we have some variability, but with sample we can know how far that variability can go. And Linda already talked about calculating your application rates and time. So follow the 4 R's. Manure and compost are very good thing, but too much of a good thing might become a problem. So do not over apply. So something I always ask when I'm talking about my composting schools and nutrient management is piling corral manure considering composting? Because sometimes people say, oh, I have some compost to sell you or to give you. And in reality, what they have is aged manure. It hasn't gone through the real process of composting. So yeah, the answer is no. So you can leave the manure there for 2 or 3 years and will resemble compost. It will look like compost. But on that case, you're gonna need to worry because you lost a lot of nutrients. After 2 or 3 years, that thing have been blown and rain on top. So you're gonna lose more than nitrogen probably. And also that pile of manure has been catching all kind of weeds that are blowing around. If you don't do the compost process properly, pathogens also could be an issue, either human, plant, or animal pathogens. So some examples on manure application gone wrong. Again, I'm all for using manure and compost. Here we are seeing what we need to be aware of when you contract to receive or to buy some compost or to move some manure. And if you are a producer that has livestock, what things you can do to avoid these problems to the person you are selling or giving that nutrient. Those are pictures of the Gooden Community Garden. We have a section that is a garden and a section that we do sweet corn for FFA. And we've been doing some cover crops trials with the corn. So at some point, I say, well, let's do a dual cover crop and corn. So we planted the cover crop after some manure was applied. It's a community garden, so a lot of people volunteer things. So a guy told the FFA advisor, yeah, we can bring you some compost. When we have the trucks spreading the compost, I say, well, that's not compost, it's manure, but it's okay, it's a good nutrient. Let's take it. So they applied that, and well, the manure came with a surprise, the barnyard grass. And as you can see on the pictures, it was a wreck. I don't know where that manure came from, but it was loaded. If you see on the upper right, that's supposed to be cover crop. The barnyard grass took over the cover crop and took over the corn. So neither one could flourish. We should have barnyard grass and one corn stop here and there and little patches of cover crop, but everything was taken away by the barnyard grass. On the bottom left picture, you can see that's a drawn picture. You can see the left side was kind of the control where the FFA advisor apply Roundup, glyphosate to control his weeds. On the right side, we didn't control the weeds. But even after 3 applications of glyphosate, he couldn't control very well that barnyard grass. Even his yields were down. So we took some samples, and if you see on corn, we didn't have much yield on the treatment. And this yield here is not the sweet corn itself. Yield is we took the whole plant on sampling, and also we wait at the end of the season. We have someone we come with a chopper and chops everything that is left. So we got those values, both of those values. So the treatment is the one with the cover crop, and the control is the one that is only the sweet corn. So of course, in our treatment, we didn't have much corn. And if you see, I put grass, but grass should have been cover crop in reality, but the cover crop didn't come up very much. But at the end, if you see on the totals, the mass, and remember, we simulated after harvesting the sweet corn, we simulated a silage on all that. So the total mass differs only by a 10%, but on the treatment, most of that mass was barnyard grass that doesn't have a very good feed value. So this is a good example on, well, you need to be ready or know what you have on your compost or manure. And in that case was aged manure. Again, it wasn't composted. Now we have case that sometimes weeds come with our compost. And on this one, I know what that compost came from because it was some of my experimental windrows. So, and these pictures are from my garden. I took some of that compost home, and then I have kochia popping up all over my yard and my vegetable beds, and everybody has some kochia around. So I say, what happened? Well, I knew that the compost reached the temperatures and was done with the procedures we're gonna see in a little bit. So it wasn't a problem of making the compost, but that compost was there stored for a year, and all the pad I used on the dairy I used was full of kochia for years. So the seed load was tremendous on the kochia. So in that case, the problem was on the storage, not on the production of the compost. So why we have weeds in compost? Supposedly we do composting. One of the things is to reduce the mass, the volume, the weight of that manure. Another one is to take care of pathogens and weeds. But sometimes we find that some composts have weeds too. So it could be the case that some of the feedstock we add on that composting mix are loaded with seeds, and the load is so high, especially, for example, on feed refuses or all hay or hay that went, or grains that went wrong, and they were added to the compost as a feedstock. So that could happen, you know, even with the composting process if the load is so high. And also some of the weeds are very resistant even for composting. The other point is that the weeds could be acquired during the storage period. The beauty of compost is that you can make the compost this year and storage for 1 or 2 years before application if needed to. without pissing off a neighbor because of smells or something like that, as happens with manure. Manure usually needs to be moved and applied, or if you store it, needs to be stored away from other people, you know. With compost, you can do that, but you need to be careful that the place where you are storing is free of weeds and also have some protection, like a windbreak. Windbreaks work very well to stop acquiring weeds during the storing period. And that's happened with the compost I made. And when I use it, I have picked up a lot of weeds around. It could happen in some cases, contaminations during the processing and storage of transport or even application. And finally, you might have weeds already on your field. And sometimes that happens a lot. People have the weeds on their field, they apply compost or manures, and then they start calling the person and say, hey, what you sold me? You know, this is full of weeds, when they don't realize that the weeds were already on the field and they didn't take care before applying the nutrients. So how we avoid those weeds in compost? The first one is, well, remember, the stockpile manure is not compost. So when you apply manure that has been stockpiled for many years, 2 or 3 years, be aware that you might have some weeds on it. Use proper composting techniques. The process to further reduce pathogens, we're gonna see something in the next slide, is fundamental to keep those temperatures high and the moisture during the composting process to take care of the seed of the weed seeds. Part of that also is to manage the carbon to nitrogen ratio, moisture, and the curing process. Have that storage free of weeds, and screen your compost. Screening is, we always recommend the screening for several reasons. It's not that it affects that directly with the weeds, but on the dairies, we have a lot of activities going on. So usually when we compost, we might have a lot of foreign objects, from rocks to syringes to gloves, palpation gloves and others, that milking gloves that can come with the manure. So screening takes away a lot of those foreign objects, and a lot of work have been done by especially the potato industry to help compost producers understand that they don't want those foreign objects. So screening is always recommended. And of course, control the weeds on your field before the application. So what is the process to further reduce pathogen? This process was developed years ago using the worst case scenario on how to reduce pathogens in composting, using municipal wastewater sludges that they say, well, that will be the one that has the most pathogens. So if we can clear it up on that feedstock that comes straight from humans and the wastewater treatment plants, we're gonna be able to reduce the pathogens elsewhere. And it works. So basically it has a component on temperature that is 131 degrees Fahrenheit or 55 Celsius, and a time component of 3 days of maintaining that temperature. In the case of windrows that they are mechanically turned, they require 5 turns minimum. That means 5 times you reach those 131 degrees. Because the outer part of a windrow doesn't get that temperature. For that reason, you need to turn it to put what is outside inside the windrow and let it cook if you want. When you compost in vessel, like rotatory vessels or boxes, you choose aerated packs, you just need to keep those 131 degrees for 3 days. So again, that's the worst case scenario. Usually our agricultural composts, if they don't receive the water and they keep the moisture all the way, they reach about 3 times, not the whole 5 times, but still they get rid of most of the pathogens and most of the weeds too. Some temperatures, again, 131 is what regulatory, but we want to go to 145, 150 for the destructions of most weeds. If you have a very carbonous component on your compost when you are processing, be careful, don't go much more than 160, can go even 170, but you need to cool that pile down because it can catch fire. So all this works if you do maintain the proper moisture during the composting process. You try to start with the carbon to nitrogen ratio as close to 30:1 as possible. When you compost only manures with some bedding, you won't get there. So part of my work is look how we can put together different industries, the ones that have the carbon available to add to the compost and increase that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Manures usually with bedding are around 20, 25 maximum. Only manure is around 13, 15. So we are losing a lot of nitrogen during those processes. And also it's difficult to maintain the temperatures. So after you start your composting process, even adding water, if you see on the top pictures, there is the composter and they are dragging a tank with water behind. That's the picture of the second picture on the left. And on the third picture, you see a honey wagon adding water. What you don't need to do is to add manure, liquid manure, to moisten your pile after you turn it a couple times. At the beginning, it's okay because you're adding nutrients and moisture at the same time. But after you start your cycling of temperatures and turning, you don't need to add any other dirty component or manure or something like that. And that could be a contaminant, because if not, you need to start the counting again, the process again. And again, screen it and test it. That's very important. When you buy compost, ask for a test or test yourself. You know, that's something you need to agree with the person who is selling you the compost. So what happened with the pesticides and herbicides in general, especially herbicides, on composting process? So compost take care of most of the herbicides. If you see here on this table, so you have the report half time in soil and how much is the half time in compost, and how what is the plant safe concentration. So remember, half time is when 50% of that herbicide has been degraded. So usually it lasts longer, could be that it lasts longer. This is the half time, but it's how we measure this. So the two that there are highlighted in yellow, as you see, are some of the most troublesome herbicides. The most common that we use, the 2,4-D and even glyphosate, they degrade very fast in compost. Now, clopyralid and picloram are from the pyridine family. And this is a troublesome family for composting. They are very persistent. They can stay in the compost for years. And those are kind of the ones on the family that are persistent: picloram, clopyralid, aminopyralid, and aminochloride. Well, the last one is kind of difficult to mention. So this family of herbicides, the problem also they have is they remain active on the plant material after going through the digestive system of animals. Doesn't matter if it is monogastric or ruminants, and after composting. So depending on the conditions, they can remain active on soils that after you apply that compost for years. And they can damage crops at very low concentrations. Some of the uses of this family are used to control broadleaf weeds in pastures, turf, hay, and grains, including corn. And here, the list below is a lot of the horticulturals, especially crops, that they are very sensitive to this family. How bad that gets, you can see here the pictures. At the top, you have the concentrations on parts per billion. On the top is aminopyrrolate, and on the bottom is clopyrrolate. On the left, on both sides, is with yard trimmings that contains the herbicide. And on the right side, with dairy manure compost that contains the herbicide. And you see how bad it gets. These herbicides have had a lot of cases, unfortunately, that end up in court with municipalities needed to dump whole batches, and I'm talking about mountains of compost, because they couldn't use it anymore. And that's one of the risks when you do composting at the municipal level, because you are receiving a lot of things that you don't know really where they come from. On agricultural composting is a little bit easier, but you need to be conscious. If you are composting your manures, you need to know exactly the source of the feedstock of your cattle, because again, this family survives the whole process, from the guts of the animals to the composting side. So if you have a new person, you are buying a new provider of corn silage, for example, or alfalfa, you need to ask what they are using on their fields, if you plan to use that compost for something else. Liability could be too high on that case. So how to avoid the persistent herbicides in this compost? First is follow the label instructions, and you need to limit the use of these herbicides. Some people, they run to say, well, you need to stop using the herbicides, but they are an important tool for a lot of people. So what is important is that you use them in a closed loop. If you're gonna use that compost, need to be used on the same crop, not export that to another type of crop. So if you are the producer using it, be conscious where your product goes and where your residues go. If you have cattle grazing on your farm and your fields where you are using these herbicides, well, let the owners of that cattle know that you are using those herbicides. Because then if they put those cattle in a corral, they need to wait a certain period to use that manure and to make compost or give the manure away or the compost away. Have documentation of all these. And also, among that documentation, an important one is an herbicide carryover advisory. So basically, it's a spreadsheet that you put all the information with some warnings for the people who are buying or the hay or the corn silage or the grazing the residues. So here is an example of North Carolina with the carryover advisory, herbicide carryover advisory. So if you are receiving a compost of manure that you're gonna use in an horticultural crop, and the person who is giving you that or selling you that is not sure, there is an easy test that you can do to check for the Pyridine family. So it's a bioacid, and Washington State University and the US Composting Council on their websites, they have those, and anyone wants them, I can email those to you. So test it if you are not sure. If you are the producer and you know that you are selling that for horticultural purposes or flower beds, landscaping industry, tested too. The bioassay is very sensitive and it's easy to do in-house. You don't need anything special to do it. There are lab tests in Idaho. There is northern Idaho. There is a lab that tests for pyrethroids. In some cases, it's not as sensitive as the bioassay, but at least it can tell you what type of herbicide it is. So if you have a case that you need to identify, it's good to go with the lab test. So some resources on persistent herbicides. Again, Washington State University Extension, they have done a lot of work and they have the bioassay. US Composting Council, it has a lot of data on how to make the compost and how to use it and things that you can see on persistent herbicides and the life of herbicides on compost. North Carolina Extension also have good resources on herbicide carryover. Resources in compost, we have our nutrient management webpage and a lot of publications on composting. So you can go to our website and look for those publications. If you want to go really technical, you can use the On-Farm Composting Handbook and the National Engineer Handbook. Also, Cornell Waste Management Institute has very good pages and very good resources on composting. So, well, this is what I have so far. Any questions or comments?
I have some questions, Mario. This is Juliet.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I was really rather surprised to, I guess, you know, it just didn't think about it, about all the problems associated with pesticides in compost. I would have thought that after time, most of those would be gone. So how often do you actually see herbicide problems in compost, and how much worse is it to have fresh manure versus compost?
Good question, good question. In Idaho, I haven't seen many problems with the use of compost because usually we do closed loops and some of the guys, they don't use these herbicides on the valley, for example, on their crops. So, you know they have those, the dairyman knows where the feedstock comes from. Where it gets a little bit complicated is, again, for municipal composters because they receive from so many different sources. Or when you start, you know, there is that change a lot where they receive their feedstock and sometimes they don't have traceability on that. So they, you know, everybody looks for the cost benefit, but sometimes you start buying cheap sources of feed and you don't have an honest conversation with the person. Again, I haven't seen those problems here. I have seen problems in the West Coast where they mix a lot of urban and agricultural or forestry and urban sources on their feedstock. So there have been cases in Washington, Oregon, and California. Again, some of them going to court or needing to dump basically a lot of compost that they were expecting to sell for a high price, because usually when you start seeing these problems is usually when you start selling the compost for horticultural or home purposes.
Right. Okay, another question. Oftentimes the majority of herbicides used in lawns are associated with broadleaf herbicides, often 2,4-D or derivatives. Does 2,4-D regularly break down, and how often or how long of a time should you wait to use your grass clippings after an application of 2,4-D?
Let's see, that's on the table. Let's see.
I can jump in there real fast too, Mario. 2,4-D This is Pam. 2,4-D breaks down really quickly.
Really fast,
So,
yeah.
Yeah, very, very fast. So one of the fastest probably of the herbicides for this conversation. Also on soil
Oh,
for
there it
carry.
is.
Yeah, if you see in soil is 7 days the half-life. Actually on compost, this one has a little longer half-life. But for the clippings, I think that's pretty fast, yes.
Mm.
Good. And Kasha just commented that dicamba, it doesn't break down as quickly.
As
And
quickly. Well, and with dicamba also there is the drift problems, yeah.
right. Mario, I have some questions, comments on that too in that line, but others please ask questions before I get into it.
So something, Juliet, something I want to mention also, that because that's also important for vermicompost. If someone is doing composting with worms, it's even more delicate than all these, because in the compost you have high temperatures and that degrades a lot, most of the herbicides and pesticides. But with vermicompost, it's very important to know what those animals were eating and where their feedstock come from. There are a lot of cases, especially people using sheep, goat, and horse manures for vermicompost, and they use the wormers, so you kill most of your worm population.
Oh, I never even thought of that.
So I mean, that triggered that thinking now that you mentioned that. Usually the producer don't think about that. So it's in the person who is making the compost or using that manure to say, hey, I need to be aware of all those things. Or on the producer if they decide to sell the residues, or when, for example, a crop went wrong. If you have a disease and you say, well, I cannot sell this for human consumption, but it's still good for animal consumption, you need to carry over that warning that, hey, use it, but I apply this. So be careful what you do with the manure of your animals.
Wow, another thing I never even thought of. Pam, before you ask a question, can I ask another question?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay, some of the things that we have done in our studies is to take, and this actually Linda could also have some input on, but some of the things that we've done in the Kimberly area is use fresh manure to apply to different research plots for their impact on the crops that we're looking at. And I was just absolutely astounded at how very quickly increasing manure, fresh manure, laid down the barley and the wheat, but especially the barley, laid it down flat, like right to the line of where the compost, actually the manure was applied. Do you guys have any advice on that for growers? We'd love to be able to use more manure and or compost, but we noticed with the manure how very quickly the lodging went through the roof.
So, Juliet, lodging is related to a flash of nitrogen, right?
Yes, oftentimes it is.
Well, and that could be usually in the manure, still, even with application, still losing some nitrogen as ammonia. And I don't know if that will have something to do because it's more volatile and more available than in the compost itself. I mean, usually by the time you apply the manure, we say, common wisdom said that you lose more of your nitrogen, but evidently there is some that could be somehow quickly processed by the plants there. You know, in compost, much of the nitrogen is tied up on some organic form, even though some of my research is on how to retain that nitrogen when we don't have the carbon to balance the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And I use zeolites, for example, and that produced 3 times more nitrates. It converts the nitrogen to nitrate, so it could be available faster. For some crops, that's an advantage, but for others, might not.
Well, the thing that really surprised me was we did a comparison, a direct comparison using fertilizer to have the same total nitrogen per plot. And using conventional fertilizer and not manure per se, the conventional fertilizer commercially available did not lay down the crop as much as the manure did. There was something else in the manure that seemed to lie things down a lot faster.
So on
Did
the
you?
oh,
Oh, sorry. I was just going to
this is
ask.
a question. Linda might know more on the technicalities on that, but the question I have is, did you measure the nitrogen on the plants when that happened?
No, I don't believe we did. Wait, we did. Let me go talk to Amber about that, because we measured all sorts of nutrient availability and levels in the plants directly. But let me talk to Amber about that to see if there was a direct correlation associated with the nitrogen levels in the plant.
Yeah, because I mean that's kind of an hypothesis I can think about it. Is like on the synthetic fertilizer, usually it is taken or lost. You know, in the manure you have a first flash of ammonia that goes out when you put it, but after that probably it's like a constant drop that keeps going on nitrogen that is not lost so easily. But also depends on the biology of your soil. But that will be interesting to see that correlation between the nitrogen in the plant compared to the nitrogen in the soil and the source of that nitrogen.
And so did you, when you say you applied the same amount, did you account for mineralization, the increased mineralization from the manure?
I'm assuming that Amber did that, yes.
Okay, because that's the other thing is oftentimes you just look at what's readily available in nitrate and ammonium and don't think about that the organic nitrogen in it, which will become available, and then it ends up being a technically higher rate of application.
Right. Okay.
And
Yeah.
I know that April Latham also has been giving thought to maybe increase potassium. The high rate of potassium that is applied could be causing the lodging because of structural issues.
Would potassium strengthen the...
Except if there's too much in the soil, then it can inhibit uptake because plants use potassium in their roots. And so if it's too high in the soil, I think you'd have to have really high rates though, in a sustained situation, not from a single application, which is, I'm assuming, what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I remember Amber talking and April on that. They were kind of surprised on the amount of nitrogen after successive applications of manure, the amount of nitrogen that remain in the soil that probably is unaccounted for usually. So as Linda say, you might have some higher rates and you are not knowing it, you know.
Excellent. This is Pam again. Let me jump in real quick. We'll be ending at 1 o'clock. So any more questions from Mario and Linda or anything, please email, call, or text Juliet, myself, or Kasha, or directly to Linda and Mario, or anybody else who's commented. So Mario, I have back to Juliet's question is, you know, what have you seen for herbicide problems or whatnot in manure versus compost? When I get a call about these kinds of things, it's often manure, and it's sometimes interesting to track back because you got to go back, like Mario can tell you. So what can happen is your cattle or whatever are feeding on the open range or grazing, or, you know, in your own pastures, and you spray it with one of these herbicides like aminopyrrolid. I didn't see that other one real fast. Mario can pronounce it for you. But so it's after it's sprayed and it's cows are out there grazing and it's in their system. And when they are corralled, you know, then the manure, you know, you collect that manure from the corral and you don't even think about what they're eating out in a pasture rangeland. And so that carries through the cow system. And then you see damage, and you know, you have to backtrack to figure that out. So it can go, you have to keep asking questions and questions, as you all know about that. So that's one of the things that can happen. And on the late herbicide labels for it, there's a fun one. I think it might be for aminopyrrolid, which is Milestone. They have a picture of a cow, or not a picture, a drawing of a cow, and then a sign, you know, with the cross through it, like the no, you know, don't do that. So that means, you know, don't use the manure from the cow if, you know, it's been grazing and then that herbicide has been applied. So that's where I see things happening. On the crops, it's from the manure. Otherwise, even at the research station there, one year Rich Novia had used a compost, I think from a familiar company, but somehow they'd gotten manure or whatever in from one of those fields where it had that type of herbicide applied. And so one section of where they're pulling that compost out, it had that herbicide, and it showed up in his some of his breeding greenhouse plants. So again, like Mario said, you have to be really careful about where you're getting your source. Absolutely. I'll go ahead, Mario.
No, I think that's what you're saying is very important. And with Linda and all the manure management team, we are promoting the use of manure and compost. And again, not only for the nutrient value, but for all the other advantages. But yeah, I think everybody needs to have an honest conversation. The guys who are buying to feed their cattle, and then, you know, doing something more productive with the manure. Because if you compost it and you add a little bit of things here and there, you can sell that compost for a higher price. So you're gonna start hitting some consumers that they are not your regular consumers. It's not Farmer Joe down the road that's gonna put it on the same crop you fed your cattle, you know, or crops that they are resistant to these herbicides. So everybody needs to have an honest conversation, and don't take an offense if someone asks more questions, as you say, you know, because it's better to ask the question up front that need to do an investigation backwards later, you know.
I have a question. This is Brent Stoker. In testing, you mentioned testing. Where do we go for that testing, and how?
Well, the first test I will recommend everybody to do is the bioassay. And I can email, if you email me give me your email, I can send to anyone that, or if not, you can go to the US Composting Council or Washington State in Puyallup University. They developed that bioassay. And basically is you use peas that are ultra sensitive to this family, all the peas, and you put them on a pot in potting soil with certain concentrations that are quite high, the concentrations of this compost. So it's not that you're gonna grow the whole pea, because usually they get flooded with nutrients. I tried that one. But the bioassay will tell you, and they do replications, will tell you if you have a concern, because the peas don't come up, or they start coming and you start seeing the curling and the problem compared to the control. And you can do that on your living room, you know, in your kitchen or little greenhouse, shop, wherever they can get enough light. It's a very simple test. Then if everybody comes out and everybody is healthy, you say, well, I don't have any herbicide of concern. If you start seeing the curling and the stunning, or directly they don't come up, is when you go to a lab, you know. Those tests are quite expensive, so it doesn't work to do it just for the sake of doing it. The bioassay is very practical and cheap.
Yeah, and like Mario said, this is Pam again, the bioassay, the testing in laboratories is very good, but you may have a herbicide that's below the level of detection for that herbicide. And so that bioassay with that sensitive crop, which you can also use sugar beets, it'll pick that up at a lower than detectable level.
Are you meaning you can plant sugar beets and accomplish the same thing?
Well, you'd want to do it in the greenhouse, but yes, you can do that. And like Mario said, there's protocol out there. But if you want to call Mario or myself, I can talk to you about using sugar beet as well. Because a lot of you have sugar beet seed. You might not have the pea seed. But we just ran some bioassays this winter for some growers for herbicide with sugar beet, and it worked out really well.
Good. Yeah, I know the bioassay from both from Washington State University and then the Composting Council use peas because they are easy to grow, and they are extremely sensitive and they grow faster than a sugar beet. So you have your answer faster, But,
true, very true.
But
yes.
yeah, I mean, if you're a sugar beet producer, probably you want to do it with sugar beets.
And I can't run a million bioassays, but I would love to run some if any of you had any that you're worried about, and we can run that with sugar beets for you in our greenhouse at Aberdeen. So let me just make one more thing that's really important about this topic, Mario, is you talked about your feedstock, and we've seen issues, or we're hoping not to see issues with cotton seed that comes in, and it's Roundup Ready cotton seed, and so there could be weed seed in there of glyphosate resistant species, and one of them that we're really worried about is Palmer amaranth. And I guess there's no testing of the feedstock or components that comes into the state, so you wouldn't know if you had that seed in there or not, but that'll go through the diet dairy cow system and come out, and you'll have that Palmer amaranth. And Don Morishita's looked at this quite a bit, but I can't remember if he's seen any of that or not, but you don't want that weed. It's resistant to glyphosate and many other herbicide mechanism of action. And it can grow like 8 feet tall, and I have a picture of that where it's covering up the corn crop. You can't even see it out in the field. So that's very important. But Mario, do they do any screening of feedstock or anything that comes in?
Well, that depends again on the dairy. And as far as I know, no, there are not the screening. I mean, usually because dairies, they apply a good portion of their manure or compost on their own land or the land of their associates, the crop farmers they contract every year with. So they try to take care of not, spreading any seed. But I think that in this case with the Palmer amaranth, as many other cases, it will be more reactive. When it starts appearing, if it appears, is when they're gonna react. At this point, I don't know they are doing any test.
Okay. So I'm sorry I took up some of this from you, Mario, because it's actually near and dear to my heart, of course. By the way, some people call Palmer amaranth Satan. So.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know much about that specific weed to know if the compost will, neutralize or inactivate the seeds.
Not as far as I know, no.
Even with the high temperatures, it doesn't.
Even with high temperatures, but I can look into that a little bit more for you, Mario. We can put that out in the newsletter. So we're going to close up here, even though there might be some more questions, comments for the speakers or for any of us. Excellent talks, very good. We have, by the way, we have 87 people that are signed up for the Ag Talk Tuesdays. Not all of them participate each Tuesday, but we're just tickled pink, I guess you would say, about this. So questions for any of us, you can email us or call us. We have our information online. And Kasha will put out a newsletter next week that covers, what we talked about this week. And again, every first and third Tuesdays of the month, our next one is the 16th of June, and I think that's when, let's see, Shi Liang might be, Juliet and Joseph Sagers is talking that week. So again, questions, comments, please email us or tweet or text us or however you do things. And we always love to hear from you. So let's go with that. And Kasha, any parting comments?
Yes, actually, I do have a parting comment, and that is, for those of you who presented, please provide me with your presentation or versions of it, or however you want to do it ASAP. I like to get these newsletters out by Friday. That hasn't happened because I haven't been getting the content. So just a reminder to everybody who has things to add to the newsletter, please get them to me today if possible, and then I can start editing things and putting them and making them fit into the newsletter. And there was another thing I thought would be interesting to add. Oh, Mario, I thought it might be interesting to provide a protocol of the bioassay. We can insert that very easily into the newsletter. There's no limit on the length of these newsletters. Pictures are great additions. So just a reminder, get me your topics as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'm gonna email you that protocol, and a PDF is okay, or if not, I need to upload that. I can send there are too many pictures on the PowerPoint, so it doesn't go through email easily. But yeah, I can get you both, the presentation and the bioessay.
Excellent. With that, we will need to shut down for today's Ag Talk Tuesday. Remember, join us next week, or next June 16th, and please tell your friends and coworkers. Hopefully your coworkers are your friends. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. And again, if anyone has any question, they can email me anytime.